The wrench slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the gravel beneath the pickup truck. I muttered a curse under my breath and wiped the sweat from my brow. The late afternoon sun bore down on me, relentless and unyielding, as if it too were mocking my efforts to salvage the old heap of rust. The truck had sat in the backyard for years, collecting dirt, leaves, and the occasional bird nest, a reminder of simpler times when we thought life couldn't get harder. But it did. The sound of running water came from the side yard where Mary was washing down the cows. I leaned back, sitting in the dirt, watching her through the gap in the fence. She moved with a kind of efficiency that belied the tenderness of her touch. Her laughter rang out softly as she chided one of the animals for nudging her too hard. It was moments like these that I reminded myself why we were still together. Why, despite the constant uphill battle, I loved her more than anything. Dinner that night was like any other. The kitchen smelled of fried potatoes and onions, a modest meal but warm and filling. Mary poured 2 cups of weak coffee, and we sat across from each other, the worn wood of the table scuffed from years of use. Our conversations meandered as they always did. The weather, the harvest, the neighbor's dog that wouldn't stop barking at night. Mary's laugh was like a balm to me, even though I knew she was careful to keep it light. She never complained about our life, never asked for more, even when I knew she deserved it. We had been married for 4 years, and in all that time, I don't think I'd ever seen her truly angry. She was shy, modest to a fault, the kind of woman who would excuse herself to the next room if she thought a sneeze would interrupt me. Her bashfulness made me love her all the more because it came with a kindness that was pure and steady, like the rhythm of our small lives. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. Later that night, as we settled in a bed, the old mattress creaking under our combined weight, the phone rang. The sound was startling in the stillness of the house. I sat up, reaching for it, frowning at the name that blinked on the screen. Boss Thomas. Thomas? I muttered. It was odd, hearing from him after all these months. The man owned one of the largest farms in the county, and I had worked for him briefly before he let me go. Couldn't handle the pace, he said. His voice had been polite enough, but the disappointment had been unmistakable. I answered the call. Hey there, buddy. Thomas's voice boomed through the speaker. Long time, huh? Yeah, sure has, I replied, unsure where this was going. The man didn't call unless he wanted something, and I doubted this was an apology for firing me. We exchanged pleasantries, catching up briefly on meaningless details. Then he got to the point. Listen, I'm having a birthday party tomorrow. The big 3 to 8. Can you believe it? I'd love for you and Mary to come by. It'll be a good time. Music, drinks, lots of folks. I hesitated. The idea of being surrounded by Thomas's circle, wealthy landowners, sharp-dressed men, and their wives adorned in jewelry, made my stomach turn. Mary noticed the pause, her curious eyes fixed on me. Well, Thomas pressed, can I count on you to make it? It wouldn't be the same without you too. I forced a polite laugh. Sure, we'll be there. Great. Starts at 6. Don't forget to bring the missus, he added with a chuckle before hanging up. I set the phone down, feeling a knot twist in my gut. Mary's smile lit up the dim room, her hands clasped together like a child's at Christmas. A party? Oh, how nice of him to invite us. It'll be good to get out. Yeah, I said, trying to match her enthusiasm. It'll be nice. As I turned out the light, a nagging thought kept me awake. The man who had once called me useless, who let me go without a second glance, now wanted to celebrate his life with us. Something about it didn't sit right. Maybe it was pride, maybe paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an innocent invitation. And yet, as Mary drifted into sleep beside me, I decided to bury it. There was no harm in going, I told myself. It was just a party, or so I thought. The moonlight spilled through the thin curtains of our bedroom, casting pale streaks across the walls. Mary lay beside me, her soft breaths rising and falling in an even rhythm. I couldn't sleep. My mind churned over the invitation and, more importantly, the unspoken obligation it came with. A gift. What could we possibly give Thomas? The man had everything. A farm larger than our entire village, barns full of livestock, and tractors newer than my old pickup could ever dream of being. I turned the thought over, trying to find a solution, but every idea came up hollow. We had no money to spare, barely enough to scrape by until the end of the month. $300. That was all we had to our name, enough to buy groceries and keep the lights on, but nothing more. Certainly not enough for a gesture that would make a dent in Thomas's world. The idea of showing up empty-handed gnawed at me. It felt wrong, even though I knew he'd never miss it. He could buy himself 10 of anything I could afford. I got up quietly, careful not to disturb Mary, and padded into the kitchen. The faint scent of the dinner we'd shared still lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the soil tracked in on my boots. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, the cold wood against my forearms as I hunched over it. Pens. That's all we had, a box of cheap ballpoint pens from the hardware store. My first instinct had been to wrap those up as a joke. A little something for his farm office, I'd say, trying to laugh it off. But the more I thought about it, the more pathetic it seemed. I shook my head at the absurdity of it, running a hand through my hair. The truth was I didn't want to go at all. The idea of standing in Thomas's grand house, surrounded by people who'd look at us like we didn't belong, made me queasy. I imagined their curious, judgmental glances, the polite smiles they'd offer as they realized we hadn't brought a gift. No thanks. I'd rather stay home and finish fixing the truck. But then I glanced toward the bedroom door. Mary. Her excitement earlier had been impossible to miss. It wasn't often we got invited anywhere, and she'd been practically glowing at the thought of going. For her, it wasn't about the gift or the people. She just wanted a night out, a chance to forget the weight of our lives for a little while. I let out a long sigh and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. I could almost hear her laughter already, see her mingling with strangers, the way she always managed to make everyone feel at ease. That was her gift, really, her kindness, her ability to brighten even the dullest room. I pushed myself up from the chair and walked back to the bedroom. Mary was still curled on her side, her hands tucked under her cheek like a child. The faintest smile played on her lips, and I wondered what she was dreaming about. Probably something simple, a garden, the cows, maybe even the party itself. Looking at her like that, I made up my mind. We wouldn't bring a gift. Not because I didn't want to, but because we couldn't. And if Thomas had any decency in him, he'd understand that. If he didn't, well, that was his problem, not mine. I slipped back under the covers, careful not to disturb her, and stared at the ceiling until my thoughts dulled enough to let sleep take me. I woke up to the faint chill of dawn creeping through the cracks in our old wooden house. The sun wasn't up yet, but the roosters had already started their morning racket, letting me know I wasn't about to get any more sleep. Mary was still sound asleep beside me, her soft breath a steady rhythm in the quiet room. I slipped out of bed as gently as I could, careful not to disturb her. The mornings had a sort of sacred stillness to them, a pocket of peace before the weight of the day came crashing in. I walked to the stove, filling the old kettle with water and lighting the burner. It sputtered for a moment before catching, the small flame flickering to life. Warm water was a luxury out here, one I didn't take for granted. Mary and I always bathed together. It wasn't just about saving water, though that was part of it. It was one of the rare times we allowed ourselves to be close, to let the rest of the world fall away. The kettle hissed, its growing heat chasing away the early morning chill. I stoked the fire beneath it and sat for a moment at the table, watching the steam curl lazily into the air. Outside, the cows were stirring, their low grunts and snorts filtering through the thin walls of the house. They were Mary's pride and joy, and I could already picture her moving among them with ease, her hands deft as she coaxed the milk from their heavy udders. As if on cue, Mary's footsteps creaked softly behind me. She was awake. She gave me a sleepy smile, her hair still mussed from sleep, and without a word, she pulled on her boots and headed outside. Milking came first. It always did. I finished with the water and left it to stay warm, knowing she'd appreciate it when she came back. It wasn't long before she returned, her hands cold from the morning air, but her face flushed and bright. "Cows are done," she said simply, and we headed to the washroom together. There was something comforting about those quiet, shared routines. We didn't need to say much. Everything was understood in the silence between us. The water was warm, and we took our time, letting it wake us up fully. By the time we were done, the sun was up, and the day was stretching its fingers across the fields. It was only 10 in the morning, but my mind was already turning toward the evening. 6 o'clock. Thomas's party. I still wasn't sure how I felt about going, but there was no backing out now. We'd promised. Guess we should figure out what to wear, I said as we stepped back inside, shaking the water from my hair. Mary nodded, following me to the small chest of drawers in the corner of the bedroom. The thing was old. It was warped from years of use, and it barely held the handful of clothes we owned. My options were dismal. No suits, no ties, not even a decent pair of trousers that didn't have patches or frayed hems. Then I remembered my grandfather's old suit, tucked away in the back of the closet. It was far from perfect, 2 sizes too big and smelling faintly of mothballs, but it was something. Mary didn't have much more to choose from. There was one dress that stood out, though, the dress she wore when we got married. It was simple, no frills or lace, just clean white cotton that hugged her figure in all the right ways. She held it up, a wistful smile on her face, and I could tell she was thinking back to that day, the happiest of our lives. "Let's try them on," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. I slipped into the oversized suit, the fabric hanging awkwardly off my shoulders. The pants pulled around my ankles until I rolled them up. When I turned to look in the mirror, I couldn't help but laugh. I looked like a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Mary, on the other hand, looked stunning. The dress fit her perfectly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. She twirled in front of the mirror, her laughter light and free. "What do you think?" she asked, her cheeks glowing. "You look like you belong on one of those magazine covers," I said honestly. And she did. She looked like a woman from another world, one where life wasn't about scraping by, where dreams weren't weighed down by the practicalities of survival. I glanced at my reflection beside hers and shook my head. And I looked like I crawled out of a haystack. Mary stepped closer, adjusting the collar of my jacket with gentle hands. "You look fine," she said, but I could see the glint of amusement in her eyes. She wasn't lying, but she wasn't being entirely truthful either. "I'll iron it," I muttered, pulling at the sleeves that hung past my wrists. Mary laughed and kissed my cheek. "It'll be fine, really. Nobody's going to care how we look." But I cared. For Mary's sake. I wanted us to at least seem like we belonged, even if it was only for one night. I took the suit to the small ironing board we kept in the corner and set to work, pressing out the creases as best I could. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in our lives was, but it would have to do. As I worked, I caught Mary watching me from the doorway, her smile soft and full of something I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Pride. Whatever it was, it made the whole effort seem worth it. We were going to that party. Ready or not. The clock struck 6, and the sound seemed to echo through the quiet of our little home. I adjusted the collar of my oversized suit for the 100th time, hoping to make it sit better, but it was no use. It felt stiff and foreign on me, like I was trying to be someone I wasn't. Across the room, Mary slipped into her wedding dress. Watching her was like seeing a star rise, pure and radiant. For a moment, it almost made me forget how ridiculous I felt in my baggy hand-me-down suit. "You look beautiful," I said, and I meant it. She smiled at me, her cheeks coloring faintly, and for a moment, it felt like all was right with the world. But then reality set in. Out in the yard, I pulled our old bike from the shed. It creaked loudly as I rolled it out into the fading light, its rusty frame a stark contrast to Mary's glowing dress. The tires were half flat, and the chain looked like it hadn't seen oil since the Reagan administration. But it was all we had, and it would get us there faster than our feet. Mary stepped outside, took one look at the bike, and stopped dead in her tracks. "Are you really going to ride that?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with something unfamiliar. "It'll be a shame. All the rich people will be there, and will show up on that. Let's just walk." Her words hit me like a slap. Mary had never been one to care about appearances. In fact, she prided herself on being down to earth, on not letting the opinions of others dictate her life. But now, standing there in her wedding dress, she seemed different, hesitant, self-conscious. It wasn't a side of her I was used to seeing. "Walk," I echoed, staring at her. "It's 30 minutes on foot." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the bike like it was some kind of enemy. "It's better than arriving on that. Please, let's just walk." I wanted to argue, to say it didn't matter how we got there. But something about the look in her eyes stopped me. There was a quiet determination there, one I didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. So I nodded, leaving the bike leaning against the side of the house, and we set off on foot. The walk was quiet at first, the crunch of gravel under our shoes the only sound. The fields stretched out on either side of us, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Mary walked ahead of me, her dress swaying with each step, and for a moment, it was almost peaceful. But as we got closer to Thomas's house, the peace gave way to something heavier. We heard the music first, loud, lively, and unmistakably festive. It spilled out into the night, growing louder with each step we took. Then came the lights, bright and golden, casting a warm glow over the sprawling property. And finally, the cars. Rows of them, gleaming and polished, lined the driveway like a parade of wealth. SUVs, sedans, even a few sports cars. All the trappings of people who lived lives we could only dream of. My stomach turned as I took it all in. I glanced down at myself, at the oversized suit that hung off me like a burlap sack, and felt a wave of humiliation wash over me. What was I doing here? I looked like a clown, and I knew it. These people would see right through me the moment I stepped foot on the property. They'd see me for what I was, poor, small, out of place. "Let's go home," I said, stopping in my tracks. This was a mistake. Mary turned to face me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing, just looked at me with those wide eyes of hers, the ones that had always been so full of warmth and understanding. But tonight there was something else in them, something sharper, more resolute. "No," she said firmly. "We're not going home. Mary, what if this party changes our lives forever?" She cut me off, her voice steady. "What if this is our chance to, I don't know, to be more than what we are? To have more?" I stared at her, stunned. Mary had never spoken like this before. She had always been content with our life, grateful for what little we had. But now, standing there in her wedding dress, she seemed like a stranger to me, someone I didn't quite recognize. The music swelled, and the sound of laughter and conversation drifted toward us. Mary reached for my hand, her grip firm but warm. "Come on," she said softly. "We're already here. Let's just go." Reluctantly, I let her pull me forward, my feet moving on their own. But as we walked up the long driveway toward the glowing lights of Thomas's house, a strange unease settled in my chest. Looking back now, I realized that moment was the beginning, the first ripple in what would become a tidal wave. I didn't see it then, not fully, but something had shifted in Mary that night. Something small, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. And it was only the beginning. When we stepped inside Thomas's grand house, it felt like we had crossed into another world. The sheer size of it, the way the marble floors gleamed under the chandelier light, the faint smell of expensive perfume mingling with roasted meat. It was overwhelming. A young man in a crisp black suit greeted us near the entrance, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor as he approached. Before I could even say hello, he handed me a slender glass filled with golden wine. "Welcome," he said with a practiced smile, his tone warm but detached. I nodded, too stunned to reply, and glanced at Mary. She was holding her own glass, her fingers delicate around the stem. She looked almost ethereal in her wedding dress, the simplicity of it a stark contrast to the glittering outfits that filled the room. Her eyes darted nervously around the space, taking in the sea of expensive suits, shimmering gowns, and people who looked like they belonged in magazines. For a moment, I thought she might grab my arm and pull me back outside, but she didn't. The first sip of the wine was like nothing I'd ever tasted, rich and smooth, with a warmth that spread through my chest. It was the kind of drink that made you feel important, even if you weren't. I needed that feeling because every other reminder in this room screamed how much I didn't belong. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the confidence in every voice around me. It all felt alien. And then I saw him, Thomas, standing near the fireplace with a group of equally well-dressed men, turned just as we stepped into the crowd. His eyes lit up when he saw us, and he waved us over enthusiastically. "Oh, I thought you wouldn't come," he boomed, his voice carrying across the room. "I thought you'd be too ashamed." But here you are. It's cool. It's really cool. The words hit me like a slap. Ashamed? I felt the heat rise to my face, the way it always did when I was caught off guard. I wanted to say something, maybe even laugh it off, but the lump in my throat wouldn't let me. Instead, I tipped my glass back and drained it in one long swallow, hoping the wine would drown the shame pooling in my stomach. Thomas didn't seem to notice my discomfort. He clapped me on the back, the kind of hearty, overfamiliar gesture that only made me feel smaller. Then he turned to greet someone else, leaving Mary and me standing there, exposed in a room full of strangers who seemed to radiate wealth and confidence. I glanced at Mary, hoping to find reassurance in her eyes, but she looked just as lost as I felt. Her fingers twisted around the stem of her glass, her gaze darting from one group to another. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her, a crack in the poise she carried so naturally. It wasn't like her to feel out of place, but here, in this crowd, even she couldn't pretend to belong. "We need another drink," I muttered, and she nodded quickly. The second glass of wine worked wonders. It blurred the edges of the room, softened the weight of the stares I thought I felt. Mary's smile returned, hesitant at first, but growing as we wandered further into the party. The music swelled, and I found myself tapping my foot to the rhythm. By the time we reached the makeshift dance floor in the center of the room, Mary was tugging at my arm, her face lit with a childlike joy. "Come on," she said, laughing. "Just one dance." We danced. We laughed. For a moment, I forgot about the suit that didn't fit, the wine I couldn't afford, and the life that felt so far removed from this glittering world. Mary twirled in her dress, her laughter rising above the music, and I thought to myself that maybe, just maybe, this night wasn't a mistake after all. "This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Mary said breathlessly as she leaned into me. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in years. But the moment didn't last. As the music slowed, I noticed Mary's gaze drifting. Her eyes weren't on me anymore. They were fixed on someone across the room, a man I hadn't noticed before, but who now seemed to command the space around him. He was older, with white hair combed back neatly, an expensive suit tailored to perfection, and a gold watch that caught the light with every movement of his wrist. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mary didn't answer right away. She just kept looking at him, her expression unreadable. "I think I'd like to meet him," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "What?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "Why?" She turned to me, her smile strained. "He's probably someone important. Thomas wouldn't invite just anyone, right? It's good to know people like that." I didn't know what to say. Something about her tone, about the way she was looking at him, set my nerves on edge. I watched as she took a step away from me, her dress brushing against my leg. Then another step. "Mary," I said, but she didn't stop. She was moving toward him, her head held high, her steps deliberate. My heart thudded in my chest as I watched her cross the room, her figure growing smaller against the backdrop of wealth and elegance. The man turned as she approached, his white hair gleaming under the chandelier. He smiled, the kind of smile that held more power than warmth. Mary said something I couldn't hear, and he nodded, gesturing for her to join him. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as my wife slipped into a world I didn't understand, a world I didn't belong to. The thought crossed my mind, sharp and sudden. Would she fall for it? I didn't know. But even then, even in that moment, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this night had already started to change her. I stood there, gripping the empty wine glass like it was my last anchor to reality, watching Mary as she leaned closer to the man in the expensive suit. Their conversation seemed effortless, her laughter bubbling up as if she'd known him for years. I didn't know whether to feel proud of her confidence or unsettled by it. A pang of unease twisted in my chest, but I shook it off. She's just being polite, I told myself. Mary had always been warm and friendly, a natural at making people feel at ease. This was no different. Was it? I glanced around the room, feeling the weight of my own awkwardness pressing down on me. Everyone here seemed so sure of themselves, laughing, mingling, their glasses never empty, their conversations punctuated with bursts of genuine or performative amusement. If Mary could blend in, maybe I could too. I spotted a man standing near a grand bookshelf, sipping from a crystal tumbler. He looked about my age, his tailored suit fitting him like a glove, his tie a subtle but unmistakable nod to wealth. My pulse quickened as I made my way toward him, rehearsing a few opening lines in my head. "Evening," I said, my voice a little too loud as I approached. He turned, giving me a quick once-over before nodding. "Evening." I swallowed hard and tried to relax, forcing a casual smile. "Beautiful house, huh? Thomas sure knows how to throw a party." The man chuckled. "He does. But he always overdoes it, doesn't he?" The man can't help himself. I nodded along, even though I didn't really know what to say. "Yeah, that's Thomas for you," I said, as if I knew him better than I did. "Always likes to make an impression." To my surprise, the man smiled, clearly taking my words at face value. Emboldened, I kept talking, throwing out vague comments about the decor, the wine, the weather, anything to keep the conversation going. I wasn't even sure what I was saying half the time, just that it seemed to be working. But then he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked me up and down. "Where the hell did you get that suit?" he asked, his tone light, but unmistakably mocking. My stomach dropped. For a moment, I froze, the words caught in my throat. But then, somehow, I forced a laugh. "Oh, this?" I said, tugging at the oversized lapel. "My designer made it for me." "Designer?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical but intrigued. "Must have cost a fortune." Yeah," I stammered, nodding quickly. "Very expensive." I felt the heat rising to my face, my palms starting to sweat. What was I doing? This was ridiculous. I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, spinning a story that could unravel at any second. And the worst part? It was working. The man laughed, clapping me on the shoulder like we were old friends. "Good for you," he said. "Can't put a price on looking good, right?" "Right?" I said, forcing another laugh. But inside, I was panicking. What if Thomas came over and exposed me? What if he made some offhand comment about my real life, my rusted pickup, my patched-up boots? The thought was enough to make my hands shake. I need to grab another drink," I said suddenly, stepping back. "Excuse me." "Of course," the man said, raising his glass in a small toast. "Don't be a stranger." I nodded, muttered something unintelligible, and quickly made my way toward the bar. I needed to find Mary to feel grounded again. She had a way of steadying me, of making me feel like I belonged no matter where we were. But when I scanned the room, she was nowhere to be seen. "Mary?" I called softly, glancing around. No response. The music was too loud, the conversations too thick to hear anything over the din. I checked the corners of the room, the clusters of people near the fireplace and the dance floor. Nothing. My heart started to race as I made my way to the front of the house, stepping out onto the grand porch. The cool evening air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to calm my nerves. "Mary?" I called again, louder this time. The gravel driveway stretched out before me, the line of cars still gleaming under the outdoor lights. She wasn't there. Panic set in as I moved back inside, pushing through the crowd, searching every room I could find. The kitchen, the library, the sitting room, each one was filled with faces I didn't recognize, but none of them belonged to Mary. Finally, I found myself back in the main hall, standing beneath the massive chandelier, feeling more lost than ever. I hadn't seen her leave, but I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that she was gone. Or worse, that she was somewhere I wasn't supposed to find her. "Where are you?" I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. The laughter and music around me seemed to grow louder, pressing in on me, making it hard to think. I glanced toward the man she had been talking to earlier, but he was gone too. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. She wasn't just gone. She was with someone, and I had no idea where. Panic churned in my stomach as I stumbled out of the house, the cool night air doing little to calm me. I told myself she must have gone home, that maybe the party had been too much for her. Mary was strong, but she was also sensitive. Crowds, the noise, the glances, it wasn't like her to want to stay long. She just went home. She's probably waiting for me there, I repeated in my head, but the words rang hollow. Then I saw it. Parked at the edge of the gravel driveway was a Cadillac. Not just any Cadillac, but one of those sleek, black, oversized luxury vehicles that seemed to scream wealth and power. Its windows were tinted so dark you couldn't see through them, but as I walked by, something caught my eye: movement. A faint shift of shadow behind the glass. My feet carried me closer before I even realized what I was doing. My pulse thundered in my ears as I approached the car, my eyes locked on the faint, rhythmic rocking of the vehicle. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, but my body ignored it. When I was just a few steps away, I leaned down to peer through the window. And then I saw her. Mary. My Mary. Lying on top of another man in the back seat. The breath left my lungs like I'd been punched. My hands gripped the car door to steady myself, my knuckles whitening against the sleek black metal. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The dress she had been wearing was crumpled around her waist, her hair spilling across her shoulders. She was in her underwear. The man beneath her was older, his white hair disheveled, his shirt open to reveal a gold chain resting against his chest. I didn't think. I didn't reason. I just reacted. My fist slammed into the window with a force I didn't know I had. Once, twice, on the third strike, the glass shattered, spraying shards across the interior. The man shouted. Mary screamed, and I stood there, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would rip through my chest. What the hell are you doing? I screamed, my voice cracking with a mix of rage and disbelief. Mary, what are you doing? She scrambled off the man, clutching at her dress, her face pale and stricken. It's not. She stammered, but no words came. The man, red-faced and furious, sat up and pointed at me. You just cost yourself a hell of a lot of money, you clown, he roared. His voice was sharp and cutting, every word laced with venom. Do you know how much this car costs? I don't give a damn about your car, I shouted, my hands shaking as I pointed at Mary. That's my wife. My wife. He froze, his furious expression faltering for just a moment before twisting into a mocking grin. Your wife? This is your wife. What? You never told me about this clown before, Mary. He threw his head back and laughed, the sound grating and cruel. You've got a beautiful girl like this, and you show up looking like that? No wonder she's here with me. The blood in my veins felt like it had turned to fire. I wanted to pull him out of the car and beat him up, but before I could, I felt hands on my shoulders, pulling me away. I turned to see Thomas, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. What the hell have you done? He barked, gesturing to the shattered window. Do you know what you're in for? This is going to cost you a fortune. I don't care. I shouted, shrugging off his grip. Did you see what she was doing? That's my wife. Thomas hesitated, his gaze shifting to the car. The man was still lounging in the back seat, his shirt half open, looking more annoyed than embarrassed. Mary was huddled in the corner, her dress clutched to her chest, her eyes wide and full of something that looked like fear or guilt. Thomas's face turned pale as the scene fully registered. What the? He muttered, taking a step back. The man climbed out of the car then, brushing glass from his pants. He didn't even bother to button his shirt, standing there with an air of indifference that made my blood boil even more. This guy, he said, jabbing a thumb at me, is a joke. A total clown. And now he owes me a new damn window. Don't talk about me like that. I snapped, my fist clenched at my sides. She's my wife. You. My voice broke, and I turned back to Mary. How could you? She didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. Her head was bowed, her hands trembling as she tried to fix her dress. Every second of silence from her was another knife in my chest. Thomas stepped between us, his hands raised as if to calm things down. All right, everyone needs to relax, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. This is a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? I barked. Look at them. The man laughed again, low and cruel. Misunderstanding? Yeah, right. The only misunderstanding is how this guy landed someone like her. He looked at Mary then, his grin widening. You should have told me your husband was such a damn clown, sweetheart. Something inside me snapped. I lunged forward, but Thomas and another man grabbed me, holding me back. Enough! Thomas barked, his voice sharp. You're making it worse for yourself. I stopped struggling, my body going limp as the weight of it all hit me. Mary's silence, her shame, the way she wouldn't even meet my eyes. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of humiliation, betrayal, and rage, with no way out. Thomas shook his head, looking at me with a mix of pity and exasperation. You should have stayed home, he muttered. And maybe he was right. I stood frozen, my body trembling with anger and humiliation. The voices around me felt distant, muffled by the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Mary had finally stepped out of the car, still adjusting her dress, her face pale and streaked with tears. For a moment, I thought she'd say something, apologize, explain, anything. But what came out of her mouth was something I never could have expected. I'm tired of this life, she screamed, her voice breaking through the tense silence. Her eyes, red and furious, locked onto mine. I'm tired of being poor, tired of looking after cows and cleaning up shit every damn day. I want a normal life, a good life. I want money, not scraps. I can't live on $500 a month anymore. Her words hit me harder than any punch ever could. My breath caught, and I staggered back, shaking my head as if I could make it all go away. What are you saying? I managed to croak out. What I'm saying, she spat, her voice rising, is that I deserve more. I deserve a life where I don't have to work like a dog and get nothing in return. I'm done. The crowd around us had fallen into a stunned silence. Even the man from the car looked caught off guard by her outburst. I glanced at Thomas, who stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation. I couldn't take it anymore. The humiliation, the betrayal, the boiling anger, it was too much. I tore free from Thomas's grip and started running down the long driveway, tears streaming down my face. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. My thoughts raced as I ran. Her words echoed in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. Tired of this life. Tired of me. My chest felt like it was going to burst, my legs aching with each step. When I finally stopped, I was at the edge of a field, bent over, gasping for air. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my ill-fitting suit, the fabric rough against my skin. That's when the thought hit me, sharp and clear. I need to do something. She humiliated me. I'll make her regret it. I turned back toward the house, my mind racing with plans that didn't make sense even to me. As I approached, I saw Mary slip back inside, disappearing into the glowing lights of the party. My eyes landed on the Cadillac, still parked where I'd seen it. The shattered window stared back at me like a challenge. Without thinking, I walked toward the car. The door was unlocked, and the keys were sitting in the ignition, as if waiting for me. My hands shook as I climbed in, the scent of leather and expensive cologne filling the air. I stared at the steering wheel for a moment, my mind buzzing with rage and adrenaline. Do it. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The car shot forward, tires screeching against the gravel as I sped down the driveway and onto the road. The world blurred around me as I drove faster and faster, the engine growling like a beast unleashed. I wasn't thinking about anything, certainly not the road ahead of me. I was consumed by anger, by betrayal, by the overwhelming need to make her feel the way I did. That's why I didn't see the tree until it was too late. The impact was sudden, violent. The front of the car crumpled like paper, the windshield cracking into a spiderweb of glass. My head slammed against the steering wheel, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, the car was silent except for the faint hiss of the engine. I sat there, staring blankly at the mess I'd made. Slowly, the realization crept in. I destroyed a car worth more than everything I'd ever owned combined. And now, I was in for a mountain of trouble. I stumbled out of the car, the cool night air stinging my face. My legs felt like jelly as I started running, aimless and frantic. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. I screamed into the night, my voice raw and broken. Why? Why did I do this? Why? Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was hard to tell. Eventually, I found myself at the doorstep of my grandmother's house, a small, forgotten place deep in the countryside. Nobody knew about it, not even Mary. I stumbled inside, collapsing onto the old couch, my body and mind completely spent. My phone buzzed constantly for the next few hours. Thomas, Mary, unknown numbers, they were all calling, all trying to reach me. I smashed the phone against the wall, the plastic and glass scattering across the floor. I didn't want to hear any of it. For 7 days, I stayed there, consumed by guilt, shame, and anger. I didn't eat, barely drank, and spent most of my time staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how my life had fallen apart so quickly. That's when I met her. She was sitting on the steps of a nearby house, a bottle of vodka in her hand. Her name was Irina, and she looked as lost as I felt. We started talking, sharing our stories, and before I knew it, we were drinking together, drowning our sorrows in cheap alcohol. For 2 weeks, we lived like that, stumbling through days that blurred into nights, barely existing. But then, one morning, Irina looked at me, her eyes clear for the first time since we'd met. "We can't keep doing this," she said firmly. "If we're going to survive, we need to stop drinking. We need to start over." Her words struck something deep inside me. I didn't want to keep running. I didn't want to keep destroying myself. So I agreed. Together, we left the bottles behind and started piecing together a new life, far from everything we had known. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could find some kind of peace.